Why hello there, and welcome back to Let's Make Us a Character. And the final part in my epic series on whatever the opposite of epic is, game Fatal, from another time, another land. That time being 2004, and that land being the part of the internet where nobody's ever had a voluntary social interaction with a woman. And in a first for this series, in this episode, we will not be making a character, because we already made the character over the course of the previous 3 videos, and boy, was that ever a thing. Totaling up over 100 minutes and 327 rolls with 654 dice. So this time, we will just be looking at how you are actually supposed to make all of those numbers accomplish something resembling a game. So if you have not watched those previous 3 videos, you might want to do that, or else some of this isn't really going to make any sense. Although admittedly, a lot of this just doesn't make sense in general, so you'll probably be fine either way. Throughout this series, I have used the word unplayable a lot, but the truth is, Fatal isn't technically unplayable. The mechanics do function in that you can roll a die, input modifiers, and derive a result. They just function in a way that doesn't serve anything. Like, if you want to play a game where you are a dairymaid and all you do is milk cows and sell milk while constantly living in fear of the rampant rape gangs, you can do that. That is an experience that Fatal can deliver. Playing a character working a mundane occupation in a fantasy world that makes Warhammer look like Hero Kids. So, yeah, you can play Fatal, but the game you can play is one that offers no value for doing so. But as I said, mechanics are technically mechanics, so let's try to figure out what we can do with a Fatal character. Part 4. Playable in the most abstract sense. So first, let's go back to Chapter 8, Skills. Ironically, the base mechanics in Fatal aren't actually that complicated, but in the same way that the mechanics in GURPS aren't that complicated. To make a skill check, you roll 3d10, add modifiers, and compare to a threshold, or TH, because the sign of a truly great game designer is arbitrarily renaming basic concepts so that you can pretend they are unique concepts. For example, current armor instead of armor class, or just armor, which is extra stupid because you have a base current armor, adjusted base current armor, and a current armor. And if you understand, basic math, you are probably seeing a bit of an issue here. The purpose of dice in a game is throwing in a random element. In something like Dungeons and Dragons, you roll a d20 and have an equal chance of getting every result. Rolling high and rolling low are things that happen regularly and are part of the experience. If you need to roll a 16 or higher to succeed, you are going to succeed 25% of the time, because you have equal odds of all results. But when you roll multiple dice, you're going to skew the results towards the center, and that skewing is going to be stronger the more dice you add. So with 3d10, if you needed to roll a 24 or higher, that same upper quarter of results, the chances are now 8.4%. Skewing the results to the center like this cuts down significantly on those high and low rolls, in favor of pushing everything towards the center. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, but obviously the game is designed with those odds in mind, and you don't run into that situation where you need to roll these really high results to succeed. And have you not been paying attention? This is Fatal. It's not designed with anything in mind. And the expression, "it's not a bug, it's a feature," gets thrown around a lot. I may have used it at some point in one of the previous 3 videos. But here, this absurd center weighting of results is literally the feature. Like, the whole point of the mean system is that everything is weighted towards average. That's why it's called the mean system. Mean means average, in addition to meaning mean, and also mean. And like so many other things in this game, there is a fairly obvious basic idea behind this. Weighing everything towards the average will make the results reflect the statistical averages that you've set up. But also, like so many other things in this game, apparently at no point was any level of critical thought applied to that idea and whether or not it worked within the context of this or any game. Because it doesn't. And you just end up making very average rolls based on your very average sub-abilities, which, remember, were rolled with 10d100 divided by 5 minus 1, to make sure that they were just extra average. And if you do dare to stray below that center average, you're basically fucked. Like, remember, our character ended up with a facial charisma score of 45, and a modifier of minus 34 on a 3d10 roll. And just because of the kind of game that this is, it is important to point out that the penalties for below average sub-abilities are significantly larger than the bonuses for above average ones. So if you roll poorly on one of your sub-abilities, either in the actual roll or one of the massive number of other random things that can modify your scores, you are just kinda screwed forever. Like, putting aside facial charisma, our character also has a minus 17 strength modifier, and that started at 130 before adjustments. So the highest we can roll on a strength check, that 1 in 1,000 roll, is a 13. So that 8.4% I mentioned earlier would be our chance of rolling a 7 on a strength check. It's like they specifically designed the mechanics to provide the most predictable and least exciting experience possible. Or rather, the most miserable experience possible, because the rules are very heavily biased against the players. And hopefully in this video, I will be able to give you a little taste of the special kind of misery that would be actually trying to play Fatal. Anyway, back to the rules. The basics here are simple enough. However, the issues start to arise when you need to actually determine those modifiers and thresholds. So to see this in action, let's say that our character is walking, which is an application of the sprint skill. And our walk speed is 25% of our sprint speed of 43 in feet per round, or 1/20th of our sprint speed in miles per hour. And we must make a check after walking for a number of minutes equal to our physical fitness score to see if we can continue walking. So every 1 hour and 39 minutes. Then to make the walk check, we first increase the threshold by 301 minus our physical fitness of 99 divided by 40. So 5. Although it would be nice to know what we increase by 5, there is no base threshold given for the sprint skill or any kind of general base difficulty levels, only stating that the E-dial will determine the threshold with no guidance provided to help them with that. Which of course actually means that once again he just didn't bother writing the parts of the game that weren't exciting enough to keep his attention. So all we really have to go on here is the fact that a 6 is always a failure. So it must be the case that at any point where a threshold is not given, it is 7. So our threshold is 12, maybe. So we roll our 3d10 and add our 7 skill ranks, but specifically not our physical fitness skill modifier, and 20, which is a success, meaning that we can continue walking for another 99 minutes, at which point we will then need to make another check. And I just want you to imagine trying to play a normal D&D style adventure where every character has a different to-the-minute countdown for how long they can walk without having to go through that entire process to determine if they can keep walking or have to stop and rest for an equal period. That whole logistical nightmare just for walking. And as long as I'm here, I might as well explain the rest of the weirdness of the sprint skill. So sprinting is like walking, except that you move at full sprint speed and the base time for the check is physical fitness divided by 10 seconds, so 9 seconds. And a round is 3 seconds, so we need to make that check if we sprint for 3 rounds. Then if we fail that check, we must decelerate to running. Although we can attempt to sprint again after 3 rounds, no explanation of what is required to attempt to sprint again, so I guess we just ignore that part. Then running is 75% of our sprint speed for a number of rounds equal to our physical fitness, so 99 rounds. And then if we fail the run test, we decelerate to a brisk jog, then walk, then stop. And this is a prime example of how this game was designed, or rather how it wasn't. There is a clear concept behind what's going on here. You move at your sprint speed, making checks to see if you can continue moving at that speed, and then decelerating to a lower speed category if you fail. And, maybe going up at some point somehow. But it's never actually applied to anything beyond the abstract idea of a character just running at top speed continuously, moving up or down one speed category at a time, governed by some exhaustion level rules that do not exist. It does not even come close to trying to cover what to do if you say, sprint for 1 round, walk the next, then just don't move, then jog for 2 rounds, then sprint again. It's just most of the abstract mechanics for testing a character's stamina while running, without considering how you would actually use them. And worth mentioning, these are the movement rules. It's not like they are expanded upon later. But now let's look at something a bit more complicated and say that our character has decided she wants to try juggling. So we roll 3d10 and add the average of our hand-eye coordination and agility modifiers, which is plus 10. But then we subtract 13 for the learning curve, so a minus 3 modifier overall and 15, which is a failure because this skill actually provides threshold values. So lots of skills do use the average of 2 or even 3 modifiers, and then there's the learning curve, which is a negative modifier that gets reduced with in-game practice. So, for example, the learning curve on juggling is reduced by 2 for every month of daily practice. And I hate to say this, it genuinely hurts me deep down in my core, but that's actually a pretty neat idea. Instead of having trained-only skills, applying a moderate penalty that can be worked off through in-game experience without having to invest any kind of points into it. But then also, presumably because it was one of the very few good ideas in this game, it's only used in less than 20 skills, most of which are random crafting skills, which are only used by a single occupation. So earlier, when I compared this to GURPS, it wasn't just a passing comparison, because the skill system is actually kinda similar in that each skill is basically its own set of rules, running on a basic core mechanic. The difference, of course, is that GURPS is actually put together well, and they actually have a core rule system that supports all of the skills and everything else. Here, each skill is its own thing, and may or may not provide information like relevant skill modifiers to use, learning curve values, or prerequisites. Fortunately, all of that information is available on a big table, which may or may not actually be consistent with the information in the skill entries. And while there are some ridiculously complex skills, like the urinating skill that requires you to calculate what percentage of your current body weight is ingested fluids, and then cross-reference that on a table with time since your last urination, or the 3-page sexual adeptness skill, which, dead serious here, requires you to solve for y to determine a tightness modifier, most of the skills are just roll 3d10 and add a modifier, with the only rules being higher results equals better success. And as mentioned, there is no information provided to help the Game Master judge what that means, other than a result of 6 always being a failure, which, if my 7 guess is correct, would mean that the base success chance on a skill check is 98%. Which doesn't really sound all that difficult, detailed, realistic, or historically/mythologically accurate. And that is the thing that is easy to miss if you just skim through the first few chapters of this book and then assume that you know what it's like. Fatal has this reputation for being comically overcomplicated, but it's not. It's comically oversaturated. No single thing we've done in this whole series has been particularly complex. It's just having to do hundreds of things. And that's what this game is. It's just hundreds of things. It's not about having a good or even functional game, it's about having the game that has the most stuff. Like, throughout this series, I've been making a big deal about the fact that this book is 980 pages, but most of the content filling those pages is just kinda worthless filler. There are 163 occupations and 216 skills, a huge chunk of which are barely written and somewhat arbitrarily determined. Like, there is a hunting skill for the hunter, a skinning skill for the skinner, and a tanning skill for the tanner, but no butchery skill for the butcher. There are 31 divination skills, all of which function and most of which are written exactly the same. There's just a massive amount of stuff in this book that serves no purpose other than taking up space. Like, the skills alone take up 87 pages in the book and 5 on the character sheet. Basically, the author either did not see the incredibly obvious solution of condensing dozens of hyper-specialized skills into generic profession and craft ones, or intentionally did not do that to artificially inflate the skill list and page count, but then obviously wasn't going to actually bother writing rules for all of those skills. That would be boring. And I'm inclined to believe the latter, because at every turn, Fatal seems to always be intentionally making the worst possible decision for the stupidest possible reasons. Like, I have no doubt that the fantasy of being able to brag about having a 1,000-page game book with a 10-page character sheet had a not insignificant impact on the design choices. And speaking of terrible design choices made for arbitrary reasons, let's check out Chapter 10, Combat. So let's say that while cleaning the master bedroom, a goblin pops out from under the bed. That's why you need to clean underneath your bed regularly. You don't want to attract goblins. And yeah, of course monster stat blocks are full pages with separate male and female stats. So to do a combat, first both combatants roll initiative, which is calculated with a D100 plus reaction speed modifier and breadth, minus the delivery penalty of the weapon. And let's just say for convenience that we happen to be carrying a cleaning dagger and the goblin is unarmed, meaning that they do not have a delivery penalty. So what's the delivery penalty for a dagger? I bet you're thinking we just do something normal and reasonable, like look up that value on a table, like you do for ranged weapons. And yeah, of course not. It is, however, just a simple process of multiplying the dagger's weight by 10, so 10, which is the minimum strength required to wield the weapon, so check there. Then compare the length of the weapon to our height, and a dagger is 11 to 18 inches. Good thing we don't need an exact length here. And our character is 52 inches. And since the length of the weapon does not exceed 1/2 our height, we can wield the weapon one-handed without penalty. And since we are able to wield the weapon without penalty, we add the opposite of our agility modifier to that value we calculated earlier. So with a +6 agility modifier, it is 10 minus 6 to get the delivery penalty of 4. And I was only half joking when I said this was simple, because it is. Compared to the process for hacking and pounding weapons, the calculations for which involve things like the weapon's specific weight distribution and the position your hands are in on the handle. And I will get a little more into that in a bit. So our initiative is 42 plus 14 plus 26 minus 4 equals 76. And the goblins is 53 plus 0 plus 12 equals 65. Although also, initiative is by attack, so if you have multiple attacks, you roll multiple initiatives. And as we are using an agility weapon, we can make 2 attacks per round and therefore get 2 initiatives. And the goblin with an agility of 220 can make 4 brawling attacks per round and therefore gets 4 initiatives. Maybe. That's, the way this book is written, there is more than a little assumptions that have to be made whenever you are, combining the rules for multiple brawling attacks with the rules for multiple weapon attacks, with just the regular rules for initiative. But assuming that any of this is correct, we do still get to go first. And we actually roll hit location before attacking because we have to for reasons. And 63, which is upper torso on the goblin hit location table, yes, every single one of the 27 monsters included in the Navaria book has its own hit location table on its full page stat block, which I assume was supposed to be the standard moving forward, which is an interesting decision considering that he couldn't even be bothered to actually stat up more than half of the entries in the actual monster book. So the goblin's upper torso has 2 body part points, and assuming he is wearing clothes, current armor against brawling of 11, current armor against hacking of 10, current armor against pounding of 10, and current armor against stabbing of 10. And that's why we had to roll hit location first. All 17 body parts have all 4 of those armor values, which are reasonably going to be different. For example, if you are wearing a breastplate and a chain shirt, the breastplate is going to cover your torso but not your arms, and the chain shirt is going to cover your arms but not your hands. So now we finally roll our attack using the weapon specific skill for dagger, which, like skill checks, is rolled with 3d10. Then, because a dagger is an agility weapon, we add the average of our hand-eye coordination and agility skill modifiers, so plus 10, and now it is time to once again make some assumptions. The weapon-specific skill has a learning curve of 13, and an additional penalty of -5, quote, for those who have never used this particular weapon in combat or trained with it. But also, for each weapon in which 5 skill points have been invested, the weapon may be used in combat without penalty. And 5 skill points is also the requirement to ignore the learning curve. Now, we did not put any points in this skill. Instead, we just got training in it for being a kobold, which according to these rules is treated as though 5 free skill points have been invested. So I'm going to assume that used in combat without penalty includes both that specific -5 penalty as well as the -13 learning curve. And if I'm wrong, honestly, who cares? Also notable, you only get a skill bonus to attack rolls at the rate of +1 per 5 points invested in the skill beyond the first 5. So assuming no bonus or penalty from the weapon skill, our total is 17. And because a dagger is a stabbing weapon, that total is compared to the goblin's upper torso's current armor against stabbing, which is 10. And since our total attack met or exceeded the relevant current armor value, the attack is successful, which unfortunately means we have to continue. A dagger deals 1d10 damage, so 6. But then, hypothetically, if we were wielding a hacking or pounding weapon, we would need to modify the damage based on the fulcrum point, which, as mentioned earlier, is the point where you are holding the weapon and also affects the delivery penalty. Essentially, shifting your hand position allows you to sacrifice accuracy for damage, or vice versa. And this isn't like choosing between an accuracy, balanced, or power stance or something like that. No, it is a range that can be as large as 5 to 90, and is presumably intended to be a thing that you would change during the course of a fight. Then, if we were wielding a strength or strength agility weapon, we would apply our damage modifier. And remember, our damage modifier is minus 17%. So, good thing a dagger is an agility weapon. And also that the author forgot to include rules that penalties apply even when bonuses don't. Based on the rest of the game, I'm sure that was the intention, but it doesn't say it, so we don't have to deal with it. Now, clothing does not have any damage adjustments for stabbing damage, so nothing to apply here, but other armors do, so once again it's just a thing that's worth mentioning. It does, however, have 2 integrity points, and on a successful attack, damage is dealt to the integrity points of the armor, and this actually gets way worse. So, in addition to your armor taking damage on any successful attack, it also takes damage on an attack that rolls to hit your adjusted base current armor, excluding the armor's bonus. And as you've seen, at the low end of weapons, a dagger deals 1d10 damage, and at the high end, a maul deals 4d12 plus 4, which with the highest fulcrum adjustment is 28 damage on average, not taking into account strength modifier. Which, notably, any male character is likely to have a positive strength modifier, considering that they get to increase their strength by 30%. Now, the best armor available would be a breastplate, with an armor bonus of 15 and 25 integrity points. But remember, you don't have to hit that plus 15 value to damage the armor, and even with a 70% reduction to pounding damage, a maul is still going to average 8 damage, so 3 hits are probably going to destroy a breastplate, or literally any other piece of armor, which of course you need to track for 17 different body parts. And incidentally, a dagger dealing 1d10 damage would average 4 damage against a breastplate, likely with a lower delivery penalty, and 2 attacks per round, so with a bit of luck, you can also destroy a breastplate in 3 rounds with a dagger. And keep in mind, that is not versus average armor, that is versus the best armor in the game. So back to our attack, our 6 damage obviously destroys the goblin's 2 integrity point shirt, and then obliterates the goblin's 2 upper torso body part points, and reduces his life points by 2. You can never deal more life point damage than body part point damage, and since the goblin's upper torso only has 2 body part points, that is the maximum life point damage that can be inflicted with this attack. However, as you may recall, losing all body part points in your upper torso is death, so goblin dead. So just to recap, to make an attack in Fatal, you roll initiative for each individual attack, roll hit location, reference current armor for the rolled body part against the specific damage type of the attacking weapon, make attack roll, apply weapon penetration modifier, maybe, there's a reason I didn't mention that one earlier. If successful, roll damage, adjust damage for fulcrum point if applicable, adjust damage for strength modifier if applicable, adjust damage for armor modifier against specific damage type if applicable, apply damage to integrity points of armor in the affected location, even if the attack only hits the base current armor, apply damage to the affected body part points, apply damage to life points not exceeding total body part point loss, and if the target miraculously survives, roll to see if the wounds get infected. And it's worth pointing out here that they never provide an outline like that. Everything is just kind of scattered throughout the book and also written horribly. So I don't actually know if the penetration modifier is applied to current armor. All the book says on the issue is, penetration is a listing of modifiers against light/medium/heavy armors for that specific weapon. I don't know what that means, and I'm not sure he does either. So, like everything else in this game, even combat with all of its stupid, overcomplicated formulas and 13-step process, including up to 3 percentile adjustments to damage, is just a loose collection of rules that are never tied together in any way that might suggest a coherent gameplay experience. You may have noticed that I did not say anything about reach or movement. Well, neither does the book. We know how far we can move per round at various speeds and for how long, but not if we can move and attack in the same round. The combat rules only really cover the specific action of making attacks. The closest thing to movement rules are the ones for charging, which really just gives you the modifiers for charging without actually telling you how to charge. There's also a list of actions and durations for those actions, but never an explanation on how to apply them. And also, no duration is provided for any kind of movement, and the duration value it references for melee weapons on the melee weapon table just doesn't exist. Then there's a section stating that characters have to make a check to change their intentions after they've started an action, which seems to suggest some kind of second-by-second round tracking system that also doesn't exist, and based on the rules we do have, there is no way that the example provided could ever actually occur, unless characters have to declare actions at the beginning of a round, which is of course never mentioned. And then even if you do manage to make all of that work, multiple initiatives for multiple attacks are a thing, so if I have 2 initiatives, when can I draw a weapon, or move, or open a door? Reading through the rules for multiple attacks, it seems very clear that they only took into account the idea of 2 characters standing arm lengths apart and just wailing on each other. Like everything else, it's just abstract, isolated mechanics. And once again, you can see the wheels turning. Haha, I'm going to have adjustments for attack and damage based on the fulcrum point of the weapon because realism, I am so very smart. But then you can also see the wheels just grinding to a halt when it came time to actually put all of the rules together because there was never a cohesive design behind them. Overall, it just has this feeling of a random assortment of house rules for a game that doesn't exist. You can piece most of it together, but there's just a very strong feeling that there is some information you are supposed to have, but do not. Anyway, for defeating the goblin, we get absolutely nothing. But if we do a good job cleaning up the mess and avoid getting beaten, we will receive 11 advancement points at the end of the day, which is my clever transition into Chapter 16, Advancement, where things continue being very stupid. So as mentioned in Part 3 probably, each occupation has a specific way that they gain advancement points, and only gain advancement points in that way. For example, Berserkers gain AP equal to damage dealt in combat. Sorcerers gain AP equal to magic points used to cast spells times 3. Assassins gain AP equal to the total life points of their target multiplied by the silver point value of their payment for killing said target. Mountaineers gain 100 AP for each mountain climbed. Dice makers gain 1 AP for each die made. Scholars just gain 1 occupation level every year of study without any AP. Skinners gain 5 AP per creature successfully skinned. Butchers gain 1 AP for each 50 creatures successfully butchered. And of course, a chambermaid gains 10 AP per day of satisfactory cleaning. So some occupations can rack up dozens of advancement points a day, and some can barely make 1. And then some just get big lump sums for achieving large tasks. And how many do we need to advance? Well, to advance from level 1 to 2 is 1,000 advancement points. And then that doubles at every level afterwards, which I'm sure is because of big brain, scientific, historically/mythologically accurate reasons, not just because the math was easy. Also, assuming this is cumulative point cost, that means that levels 2 and 3 have the same advancement point requirements. So to reach level 2, a mountaineer needs to climb 10 mountains, a chambermaid has to clean satisfactorily for 100 days, a dice maker has to make 1,000 dice, a fisherman needs to catch 10,000 fish, and a butcher must butcher 50,000 creatures. As you can see, balancing the play experience was a top priority here. But also, we don't actually start at first level. No, that would be too simple. Instead, a character starts at an occupation level equal to, you're gonna love this, the square root of the number of years of experience. You know, I feel like requiring a square root for something was a very important part of the Fatal experience that was missing up until this point. So, with 11 years of experience in the custodial arts, our character is a level 3 chambermaid. Maybe. It only actually says that here, and at other points in the book it does seem to suggest that you start at level 1, but who cares? And since we have basically gained 2 levels, we now need to level up. So, the important elements of increasing a character's level are as follows. Training, which isn't so much a thing you get as a thing you have to do to advance. Basically, some occupations just say things like, to train, an assassin must learn better killing techniques and better methods for getting close to a victim unnoticed. And when I say some, I mean 7 out of 163 occupations, with training none pointlessly listed in the entry for every other occupation. And some of that wording does sound like you would be getting new abilities, like better killing techniques and better methods for getting close to a victim unnoticed, but no, training doesn't actually give you anything. But back to leveling up, we get skill points, magic points if applicable, and spells if applicable. And since magic points and spells are not applicable, all we get is 2d10 skill points. So 1 and 9. All of which must be spent on occupation skills, which for some occupations is fine, but remember, for a chambermaid, and many others, is limited to a single skill. Although I guess it could be worse, some occupations have no skills, despite the fact that it was deemed necessary to add dozens of pointless skills used only by a single occupation. And you might be thinking that this is just another point where Fatal has dropped the ball and not taken into account an obvious thing that they intentionally did. But no, they do specifically state that those occupations just do not get any skill points for leveling up. So they literally get nothing, which, if that's not an apt metaphor for playing this game, nothing is. Also, we do continue getting those age-based skill points every time our age increases, although there is this whole stupid thing about what skills the E-dial should allow players to take. As I said in the last video, this game encourages the E-dial having a weird, almost fetishistic amount of power over the players, telling them to do things like not let players put points into skills that they want to learn, only ones that they have used in the previous year, making them re-roll skill points if you don't think they've rightfully earned as many points as they've rolled, or balance overpowered characters who rolled too well by taking away their money or giving them debilitating illnesses. Incidentally, the solution to underpowered characters is that the players just deal with it. And of course, from the last video, telling players that they have to bargain with the E-Dial to allocate potentially hundreds of skill points in a less stupid way. Basically, it kinda feels like the book wants the E-Dial to be the group's daddy-dom. I'm surprised it doesn't tell you to pat players on the head and call them a good boy when they roll well. I'm just kidding, that's way too healthy and rewarding of play for this game. Also, you better hope that your occupation includes a weapon skill, because remember that it takes 5 skill points to get a +1 bonus. And for most races, 4 is the maximum number of skill points you can gain per year as a young adult or older. Assuming that the E-Dial doesn't make you put all those points into fishing or something because you caught more fish than slayed foes in the previous year. And the big thing you are probably noticing here is that skill points are the only thing that non-magic users get for leveling up. So our pathetic 13 life points are never going to go up and are fairly likely to go down, as there are a whole host of things that can give you permanent penalties to your assorted sub-abilities. And at level 3, that also means that we are now going to have to do 200 days of satisfactory cleaning to advance. Or are we? So yeah, they may have actually realized that the system of earning thousands to millions of advancement points one at a time per shoe made was, kinda really stupid. So an additional advancement system was added, which is possibly even stupider. In this system, the E-Dial, determines a number of bonus points based on the average advancement points required to advance for all characters, which is very simple until it's not. And these are the advancement points that you can receive for completing adventures, at the rate of 25% of that value being awarded for achieving the goal, and another 25% for group cohesion, as well as 10% each for overcoming insurmountable odds and/or noteworthy creativity. So basically, every adventure that you don't fuck up is going to give you a quarter to half of that bonus point value, and if you're kinda okay at math, you might be noticing a problem here, but if you are a big brain hyperlogical Fatal player, I will try to explain it slowly. Basically, this means that every successive adventure is going to award around half as many advancement points as the previous one, until someone levels up by making a set of dice or something, at which point the value is going to shoot up again. Also, for such a difficult, detailed, realistic, and historically/mythologically accurate game, that means that advancement point awards aren't actually based on anything other than the number of points that the characters need to level up. And yeah, you do still continue gaining those occupational AP awards, but even for the occupations that get relatively good payouts, they become negligible almost immediately. With the possible exception of assassins, who can reasonably make thousands of advancement points on a single kill, as long as they're being paid enough to do it. And it kinda has this feeling of almost realizing that the system where you have to be actively delousing people to advance at a snail's pace doesn't work, and then going in the complete opposite direction by adding a second system that just drops a massive amount of AP on the characters, but then also designing that system so poorly that the actual awards are just an assortment of randomly fluctuating values affected by nothing other than the current AP and occupation levels of the characters. Like, here's a fun scenario. As a level 3 chambermaid, we need 2,000 points to advance to level 4. And let's just say that we are out adventuring with our good friend, the average stats elf from the previous video, who started with 939 skill points, and with hundreds of years of experience, is a level 13 soap maker, who needs 2,048,000 points to advance to level 14. And obviously they are not going to do that by making 204,800,000 pounds of soap. So that would make the average number of advancement points needed to level up 1,025,000. So then after a successful adventure with good group cohesion, we should gain 512,500 advancement points, catapulting us all the way to level 10. Except that we would actually only gain 5,999. Because in another fixing this would take effort moment, it's just stated that characters should not be allowed to level up more than once per session, which, as I just explained, is incredibly easy to do, and that any additional advancement points should be truncated to just below the second level. So, once again, when the broken rules would actually benefit a character, they are to be handicapped to make up for the incompetent game design, but when they hurt the player, tough luck, kid. So that's basically it for advancement. And do you want to hear about the very non-broken multiclassing? So basically, a character may do many things once they advance an occupation level, such as continue in their current occupation, change occupations, add a new occupation and pursue them one at a time, or add a new occupation and pursue them simultaneously. And because this is Fatal, the most difficult, detailed, realistic, and historically/mythologically accurate role-playing game available, there are, of course, distinct and well-defined differences between those things, right? So I already covered continuing in the current occupation, so changing occupations is just doing a second occupation, and not doing the previous one anymore, but also being able to return to the first one at any time. Notably, there's no actual rules in this section. Multiple simultaneous occupations actually has rules, stating that one occupation may be added per level, so a character must reach second level in their first occupation to take a second. And then the characters advance in the multiple occupations as normal, and they do provide some examples of how that works. So an incorporated simultaneous advancement would be like a sorcerer who adds the occupation of assassin, and then when killing a target with magic would receive assassin AP for killing the target and sorcerer AP for casting the spell. And separate simultaneous advancement would be like a laundress who learns that the fair is coming to town and decides to start working as a prostitute. Seriously, he can't even go 4 pages without any of this incel shit. And then there are successive occupations, which is nothing. It's literally exactly the same as changing occupations, which was also nothing. Basically, there is one poorly defined type of multiclassing that they have tried to disguise as 4 different types of multiclassing for some reason. And a few issues here, aside from their choice of examples. Does that mean that any character who starts the game at higher than first level, which is supposed to be the norm, is allowed to take a second occupation during character creation? And if so, do they gain that occupation at a level equal to the square root of the number of years working the second occupation? And now that you have 2 different occupations with 2 different levels, when can you take a third one? At the 3rd level of your first occupation, or at the 2nd level of the second? And if you do start with hundreds of years of experience, a thing that is not just possible but likely for elves and dwarves, does that mean you can start with a similarly high number of occupations? And perhaps most importantly, how does this affect the second forgot to start the assignment until the morning it was due advancement system? Do you take the average of all occupations for all characters, or just every character's first occupation? Or does the average number of AP needed to advance a level only count each character's occupation with the lowest number of AP needed to advance a level? And then assuming that you figure out how many points to award, how are those points awarded? The rules do say that you may award up to a maximum of 25% of the BP to each surviving character. So how do they then apply that? Do they get to choose how to split the points between all of their occupations? Is it just split evenly, or does Daddy get to decide for them? Is that the difference between changing occupations and pursuing multiple occupations? Because there are no actual restrictions on changing occupations. It basically just says you can go back at any time. And here's another thing. What are the restrictions on what additional occupations you are allowed to take? Because there are not any listed, but based on the way this game works, it seems like you should have to write a 10-page essay to the e-dial about why they should let you take a second occupation. But there are no rules on that, so I guess we can just say that our character is now a level 1 gladiatrix. Overall, the entire advancement chapter feels like it's 3 pages written by different people who did not read the other 2 pages. And for some reason, the advancement chapter also randomly includes the section on character concept. You know, that thing you are presumably supposed to do during character creation, found conveniently here in the back of chapter 16. And in a very fatal move, it is suggested that, at the least, a player should write an explanation of their character's family history, major events in the past, reasons for choosing their occupation if they have one, and future goals. Anyway, you want to see what the author chose to provide as an example character concept? Of course you don't, but too bad. Here's Godricus, the 31-year-old human slave trader. Okay, he must be doing it on purpose at this point, right? Nobody is just this fucking skeezy by default, are they? He has to be actively trying to put something politically incorrect at every possible point. An adult human being can't actually lack this much self-awareness, can they? Anyway, the highlights. Godricus' father taught him that slavery is a part of nature and, like anything else, can be good or bad. His mother was a slave who his father fell in love with, and then later sold, which taught Godricus an important lesson that everything and everyone has a price, especially women, including your own mother. And now he travels abroad trading slaves and hoping to eventually find an exotic beauty and settle down. And yes, it is very clear that find means buy. And you might be thinking, wow, that sure is a fucking thing that someone felt was an appropriate representation of a character in their game. And yeah, they sure did. So we've got slavery is natural. Gee, I wonder where he got that idea. Oh yeah, Aristotle. As well as the weird fantasy of consensual relationships with enslaved women. Like, this dude just fucking loves telling on himself and his weird power fantasies. And if you are extra concerned about the fact that exotic in this context is often code for non-white, well, don't worry, because there are no non-white humans in the world of Fatal. Just a thing that I like to point out in each of these videos. And there's a chance that you might be thinking that presenting a character who condones slavery doesn't necessarily mean that the author condones slavery, and yeah, actually it does. Especially when there is no suggestion that said character is in any way wrong. Or, you know, when a character who opposes slavery is very specifically stated to be wrong for questioning it. And that, fortunately, my dear friends, is it for Fatal. A game that really does not deserve this much attention, but I just kinda overdo everything. And when it comes to analyzing this thing, I think it is important to keep in mind that Fatal is, at its core, a derivative game. Now, I'm not saying that that is a bad thing on its own, just that it is very clear that the intention here was, it's like X, but Y. It is the ultimate fantasy heartbreaker. And it feels very thematically like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and mechanically like GURPS, but without understanding any of the actual design of either of those two games. Like, the massive selection of largely mundane occupations do seem strongly influenced by Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. The difference being that In Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, a fisherman has access to the fish, sail, and swim skills, with a 25% chance of river lore, boat building, and cartography, in addition to characteristic increases. Whereas in Fatal, a fisherman has access to the fishing skill. And that is the difference in understanding of design. In Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, fisherman is a career that involves many skills of a well-rounded person. In Fatal, a fisherman uses fishing skill, and that's it. Like sailing and swimming are both skills in Fatal, fishermen just do not have access to them. Incidentally, no occupation has the swim skill in Fatal, not even sailor. As I mentioned, the actual detailing of most of the occupations is incredibly low effort, usually consisting of 1 or 2 skills. Furthermore, Warhammer understands that this is a character background, that a character is supposed to be going on adventures, and that is how they advance. Whereas in Fatal, it is assumed that a fisherman is just going to fish and advance by catching fish, and that's it. And that brings us to the really big non-understanding point, because the real difference here is that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was designed with the understanding that it's a game that people might play, and Fatal just was not. It's easy, really easy, to look at Fatal and say, I can't believe someone made this and expected anyone to actually play it. But as I've said, I don't think the reality of people actually trying to play this game was ever seriously considered. It's not a game made to be played. It's a game made to make some asinine point about how detailed, difficult, etc. of a game you can throw together. That's why it falls apart so quickly. It isn't a game, it's one man's manifesto on what he thinks a game should be, but was then too lazy and or incompetent to actually make that game. Basically, Fatal is a collection of disconnected minutiae. Every single one of the author's ideas of how to make a better game just kinda crammed together in an obnoxiously large book, without any actual consideration for how all of those ideas would fit together. Basically, he designed the details first, and the core structure never. So while you don't have, like, cohesive combat mechanics, we do have a spell that makes someone fart. And that also means that he didn't seem to be capable of recognizing when a rule should be made to cover a large amount of things. For example, the phrase, "The target creature must be touched successfully. If the target creature resists being touched, then the caster must make a brawling skill check. See Chapter 8, Skills," appears as part of a spell's description more than 200 times. And a competent designer would look at that and say, hey, that is literally pages of unnecessary repeated text that could be removed, while also making things simpler by making one rule that explains it once, and then just referencing that as some kind of, I don't know, melee touch attack. Like, when you are trailing behind Dungeons and Dragons in terms of basic game design ability, you are doing something very wrong. And once again, it's a thing where you have to question if the author was too stupid to understand how much space was being wasted and how significantly that affects readability, or if he was intentionally padding out the book as much as possible because he wanted to be the biggest, most detailed RPG book ever. Because there's also just so much completely worthless stuff in this book, like a D2000 table of random magical effects, most of which I think are supposed to be funny, and admittedly one of which is actually the only funny thing in the entire book. And then in addition to those 40 pages of wasted space and time for anyone who accidentally uses them, there's another 10-page phobia table, and another 41 pages spent on another D2000 table, this time for random spell ingredients, which once again is mostly a collection of edgy shit that the author either thinks is funny or gets off on, and only serves the purpose of adding 40 pages to the book and making a basic task unnecessarily complicated. Like, there is just so much filler here that I genuinely wonder if you handed this book to a competent editor, if it would come back much longer than a standard core rulebook. And that is pretty much all of my thoughts, for now at least, on Fatal. A game with a reputation for being a racist, sexist, pointlessly edgy, overly complicated, obsessive work that one man poured years of his life into. Whereas, in reality, it's more of a racist, sexist, pointlessly edgy, overly complicated, half-assed work that one man poured probably a few weekends into, and then spent more time arguing about it on the internet than actually working on it. And if I could add anything to the general discourse on Fatal, I would like it to be the fact that, aside from a few isolated mechanics, the overall design here is actually fairly low effort. A huge amount of those 980 pages are taken up with filler or just blank space. When we talk about the actual game aspect of Fatal, we tend to focus a lot on the bad design choices, but it's also really important to keep in mind just how poorly those design choices were executed. Fatal isn't just a bad game, it is one that specifically fails at what it set out to do. And thank you for watching, with extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, Randy Mulholland, and Toshi Rokuro. If you'd like to be cool like them, check out my Patreon where you can get early access to videos and fun stuff that I make for the Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos floating around screen that either myself or the cold, heartless YouTube algorithm have lovingly selected for you, which I'm sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.